Although pain does not seem like it's a very pleasant thought, it's actually really kind of a blessing for the body because it warns us of actual or impending tissue damage. So it activates a protective action that will protect us in the long run. Some of the stimuli include extreme pressure and temperature, histamine, and some other things. These impulses, they tend to travel on specific types of fibers, which are usually small non-myelinated C fibers, and they release neurotransmitters like glutamate and substance P. Specifically, substance P is one that is associated with pain that you should be aware of. Pain can be blocked by certain medications like ibuprofen, for example, but it can also be blocked by inhibitory endogenous opioids, which are things like endorphins. So when people get the so-called runner's high, that's actually an endogenous opioids. And some studies have actually shown that these endorphins are strong, even stronger than heroin, believe it or not. So if we are sensitive to pain, it could mean a low pain tolerance, not a low pain threshold. The perception of pain does follow very specific pathways, which is quite interesting. So there's two different types of pain. There's visceral pain. Visceral pain results from stimulation of visceral organ receptors, can be felt as maybe vague, aching, gnawing, burning. It could be activated by different tissue stretching, ischemia, which is a lack of oxygen, chemicals, muscle spasms that could happen. And there's another type of pain called referred pain, which is when pain comes from one part of the body and it's perceived as coming from a different region of the body. And the reason for this is that sometimes visceral and somatic pain fibers, remember, this would be pain that's coming from the body because of the word somatic, they actually travel along the same nerves. So the brain assumes that there's pain coming from a specific area when it's really not. But a lot of these referred pain pathways are super important to know, especially based on the career that you're planning on going into. One of the most important that everybody should know is left arm pain usually occurs during a heart attack. So, this pathway that you see right here highlighted in blue over the left breast and the medial side of the left arm, the fifth phalange, as you can see here, is associated with heart pain, also the left side of the neck. A lot of the others tend to make sense because they're located directly over the organ. For example, this is where the appendix is, so it would make sense that there's pain directly over that region. But some of them are exceptions. And this, again, this explains referred pain because visceral and somatic pain fibers are going to overlap. One would be the gallbladder. This is where the gallbladder is. But notice on the right shoulder, there's some gallbladder pain as well. One of the others would be the lungs and the diaphragm up here. Liver pain could be in this area, as well as located over the liver. Now, when we talk about nerves, we refer to them with some of the similar terms that you learned back in chapter 9. A nerve is a cord-like organ of the peripheral nervous system. Things that I kind of described earlier as wires, and they are bundles of myelinated and non-myelinated peripheral axons enclosed by connective tissues. And the two types of peripheral nerves that you're going to be learning in this chapter are spinal nerves as well as cranial nerves. And where they are similar to that of the muscular system is the prefix. We have endoneurium instead of endomysium, perineurium, which surrounds a fascicle, just like in chapter 9, and then the epineurium, which surrounds the entire nerve. So when we look over at this diagram here, and it's a similar diagram you should know for your lab, this is the axon with the myelin sheath surrounding them. The connective tissue surrounding that is the endoneurium. Groups of fibers form a fascicle, which is surrounded by the perineurium. And the entire nerve itself, like the sciatic nerve or femoral nerve and so on, would be the epineurium. Our next slide is on the structure and classification of nerves. And most of the nerves are mixtures of both afferent and efferent nerves. Remember that afferent is sensory and efferent is motor. So essentially, we have a wire with highways that are going in both directions. And when that's the case, they're called mixed nerves. They have both sensory and motor fibers. So they travel to and from the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. So sensory afferent nerves, you should know by now, are towards the central nervous system, and motor or efferent nerves travel away from the central nervous system. So you should be aware of this terminology that is shown here. This next slide shows ganglia, and the term ganglia, as you've learned before, is a term that we're just using for the peripheral nervous system. It's a term for neuron cell bodies associated with nerves in the peripheral nervous system. So one example would be the dorsal root ganglia, which is somatic and sensory. So it's going into the spinal cord. Another example would be the autonomic ganglia, which you'll be learning about in the next chapter. So you know that neurons are amiotic, but if there is damage to them on the fiber, specifically the axon, they actually can regenerate. So mature neurons are amiotic, but if the damage is at the peripheral axon, it may generate, but it doesn't if it's in the central nervous system. So in the central nervous system axons, most never regenerate. But if it's in the peripheral nervous system, it can regenerate if the damage is not severe. And the way this happens is essentially there's axon fragments and myelin sheaths that are distal to the injury that degenerate. Macrophages come in to clean up the dead axon debris. More Schwann cells are stimulated to divide, and eventually new myelin sheaths form. So that's what we see on this slide here. So in number 1, we can see that the axon fragments here. The cut axon kind of seals itself off, and there's degeneration of the distal end of the cut axon. You don't need to know the term Wallerian degeneration. The Schwann cells and the macrophages are going to clean out the dead axon to the injury, just like if there was damage to another tissue area in the body. The third step is that there's going to be new axon filaments that are going to grow a new regeneration tube. Finally, the axon regenerates and a new myelin sheath forms. So it is quite interesting that a new axon can grow, but not a soma. So it's all dependent on where the damage actually is.